Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio. You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
Hello again, this is Jay Shapiro. Thanks for listening. After I prepared this week's program, I saw a fresh news item that I want to share with the listeners. Our outgoing president, Reuven Rivlin, made a final trip before leaving office. He went to Washington and he met with the president and congressional leaders. President Biden said, and I quote, "Iran will never get a nuclear weapon on my watch. My commitment to Israel is ironclad, and I have an unwavering commitment to Israel's self-defense. My team and I are already working with Israel's government that took office earlier this month. I'm looking forward to hosting Prime Minister Bennett at the White House very soon." Unquote. Now, all this is good news as long as Biden remains in office. But when I see him speaking on television, I see the way he has trouble expressing himself, stumbling when walking up steps. I worry whether his vice president has the same commitment that he does. Time will tell. The items that I discussed this week are primarily related to Israel's defense treaties and improving relations with nations in the Gulf. The prime enemy of these nations is Iran, and the pressures resulting from local fears of Iran has caused a number of them to see that improved relations with Israel will be helpful. The situation in the Middle East is radically different than it was just a few years ago, and the Islamic takeover of Iran about 40 years ago is having results, positive results that we could not have imagined just a few years ago. Ben-Gurion, our prime minister years ago, once said that everyone is an expert on the past. No one knows what will happen in the next 5 minutes. The situation in the Middle East is proving once again how true this is. Thanks for listening. I'll be back after the break.
How did a nice Jewish girl from Delaware end up living in Israel? Shalom, I'm Natalie Sapinski. Join me on my show, Returning Home. Meet different people who have moved to Israel. Hear their personal stories, their highs, their lows, and everything in between. Each week, we talk to experts on immigration and the process of moving to Israel. Listen to Returning Home every Thursday, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. Israel is going to get a new president next week. And the question is, people often ask, why does Israel need a president? And the answer, I believe, is because the position is essentially apolitical. So the next question is, why then have the overwhelming majority of Israel's presidents been politicians before being elected by the Knesset to be the president? And the answer is fairly simple. The president is apolitical in terms of favoring any particular party or parties, but is not an apolitical position when it comes to defending Israel's interests in the world. A perfect example in the current climate is the many conversations that our President Reuven Rivlin has had with presidents of other countries in relation to the allegations against Israel of war crimes that have reached the International Criminal Court. It's important that leaders of other countries understand and agree with Israel's right to defend itself against aggression. Rivlin has made public statements on this issue. He has spoken to other presidents on the phone or via Zoom and has even made emergency trips abroad to present Israel's case on a face-to-face basis. On a local level, because he served as Knesset Speaker, which is what Rivlin did, and before that, it was on various Knesset committees, and he also served as a minister. Therefore, he is familiar with many issues affecting different segments of Israel's society, and he also knows whom he can call when problems need to be solved. The president is somehow regarded as the father of the nation in a way that the prime minister, regardless of which party he or she might represent, simply could not. Most people need a parent figure of some kind, and that's an interesting point. That's why, for example, Queen Elizabeth has remained so popular in Great Britain, and why organizations and institutions make every effort to have their milestone events celebrated at the president's residence, or at the very least have the president come to their functions. To Jewish communities abroad, the president of Israel is the closest thing to royalty. An example was a large delegation from Australia that was led by a rabbi during the tenure of Shimon Peres when he was president. The rabbi recited the blessing said in the presence of kings, explaining that since Israel no longer has a monarchy, the president is the next best thing. When presidents of Israel travel abroad, the itinerary almost invariably includes a meeting with the representatives of a Jewish community or a mega event to which the Jewish world at large is invited. There are never any spare seats. The people want to see the president of Israel, to be photographed with him, and to shake his hand. It's not only Jews to whom a president of Israel is important. When Chaim Herzog, the father of the next president, he visited Poland in May 1992. He met with members of the Association of Polish Righteous Gentiles. As people who had saved Jews during the war, they were very keen to meet with a man who had been an officer in the British Army and had been among the liberators of the Bergen-Belsen camp. The Polish rescuers wanted to meet a Jewish rescuer. 6 years earlier, Herzog had been the first president of Israel to visit what was then West Germany and had insisted on going to Bergen-Belsen, and he recited the Yizkor prayer, the memorial prayer for the dead, in order to heighten awareness of the Holocaust history. When he was in Poland, he visited Auschwitz for the same reason and unveiled a stone memorial from Jerusalem. When the Prime Minister of Israel makes a statement about existential threats or anti-Semitism, is taken in its political partisan context, whereas when the President of the state speaks on the same subjects, it's accepted he's speaking on behalf of the whole nation. That is something that the President has an advantage over the Prime Minister. When something of great national importance needs to be said publicly abroad, it's more often the President and not the Prime Minister who says it. For example, few people believe that Prime Minister Netanyahu, who's now in the opposition, few people believe that he was sincere when he talks about peace with the Palestinians, whereas Rivlin is believed because from day one he has repeatedly said both in Israel and abroad that Israelis and Palestinians are not doomed to live together but destined to live together. He also draws frequent attention to the fact that his father translated the Quran and other Islamic literature into Hebrew well before the establishment of the State of Israel, indicating the Rivlin family had good relations with the Arab community, something that continues to this day. Rivlin is a seventh or eighth generation living in Israel, his family. In fact, Rivlin from time to time telephones, believe it or not, Palestine Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, and also vice versa, whereas Netanyahu would find it difficult to pursue such a relationship. Rivlin is a special position, especially because of his background. And on the Christian front, with the help of government press office, Rivlin meets annually with a very large delegation of mostly evangelical Christian broadcasters from around the world who individually and collectively enable him to convey Israel's message to literally hundreds of millions of people worldwide. The enthusiasm with which these broadcasters greet the president has to be seen to be believed, especially at a time when anti-Semitism is so prevalent in many countries, including in countries that have good relationships with Israel. The president is essentially not a politician. He came from the world of politics, but the president is a diplomat. He's a promoter of good causes and is involved on many levels with the Army, the intelligence service, industry, education. He's involved with women's rights, with LGBT rights. He's involved with sports. He's involved with people with special needs. He's involved with the civilian national service, Arab affairs, diaspora relations, and so much more, including many things to which the Prime Minister cannot devote time and attention, but which often need to get into the public consciousness. The President, although he comes from the political world, is not seen as a politician. He is seen as a representative of the State of Israel. A Prime Minister always is seen as a politician. That's the way it is. These are the facts of life. The President Rivlin received a farewell from the foreign ministry. He was hailed as president diplomat, and that, in a sense, said it all. The position of the president is a non-political, it's an apolitical position, although the president came from the world of politics. These are the facts of life, and we have seen this over the history of the State of Israel. Every president of the state has represented the state to others, and each and every one of them has done a good job. Some better, some less, but none of them has failed to represent the state in a very respectable way. So, although there are still people who think we don't need a president, and by the way, it is still a political part of the presidency because after each election, it's the president who calls in the various representatives of the parties in the Knesset in order to get their recommendation for who should form the government, and then he calls in that particular person. So he does have essentially a sort of, I guess you could describe it as a non-political political position. The only time he really deals in politics is when he chooses someone to form the next government. Unfortunately, by our president, or is on his way out now, Ruby Rivlin, has had that opportunity an unusually high number of times in the last 2 years. And each time he's done it with dignity. That's the bottom line. So those who think that Israel does not need a president simply don't look at the entire spectrum of what an Israeli president stands for. So again, we need a president, and this one was a very good one. I'll be back after the break.
Shalom, everybody. Making a difference often takes just one moment and one person at a time. I am Orly Benny Davis, your show host on Israel News Talk Radios from Jerusalem with Love. You'll be hearing people talking about politics, religion, social issues, and making a better tomorrow. Join me, Orly Benny Davis, for God and Country. From Jerusalem with Love.
Wednesdays on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. I had wanted to speak about Israel and Poland and the Holocaust, and I had started to prepare some notes when, to my pleasant surprise, I came across an editorial on this subject in the Jerusalem Post this week, and I'm taking the liberty to quote broadly from that editorial because it says what I wanted to say and even more. So let's put it all on the table. Before the Holocaust, Poland was the home to more than 3 million Jews and was one of the largest Jewish communities in the world. However, the majority of Jewish Poles were murdered in ghettos and death camps and concentration camps run by Germany in occupied Poland, including Auschwitz, Birkenau, the largest of the Nazi concentration camps and extermination centers. Over the last weekend, Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki pledged that his country would not pay restitution to Holocaust survivors for German crimes committed against Jews on its territory during World War II. He spoke after Poland's lower house of parliament, the Sejm, passed a draft bill on Thursday last week introducing a 30-year statute of limitation on claims for the restitution of property, thus making all Holocaust area claims now ineligible. I can only say, he said, that as long as I am the Prime Minister, Poland will surely not pay for the German crimes, not a zloty, not a euro, not a dollar. He said that last Friday. While most post-communist countries have sought to right historical wrongs and address the issue of stolen Holocaust-area Jewish property, Poland has lagged behind, claiming that it was the Germans, not them, who are responsible for the atrocities against Jews in the Holocaust. In fact, back in 2017, Warsaw enacted a law making illegal to accuse Poland or the Polish people of being responsible for World War II or for the Holocaust. Many Israeli officials condemned the law, including our president, Reuven Rivlin, who said that Poland and the Poles had a hand in the extermination of the Jews in the Holocaust. The Sejm's new legislation will make it impossible for Jewish claimants or their descendants to recover or be compensated for what was taken from them in Poland. Our new foreign minister, Yair Lapid, quickly and correctly criticized the law and as an affront to the Jewish state and to the Jewish people and the families of the victims. So no law will change history, Lapid said. The Polish law is immoral and will severely harm relations between Israel and Poland. Israel will stand as a bastion protecting the memory of the Holocaust and the dignity of Holocaust survivors and their property. He added, Poland, on whose ground millions of Jews were murdered, knows the right thing to do. Now, on Sunday of this week, the rift between Israel and Poland, which has been growing since the 2017 legislation, the rift intensified when the Foreign Ministry in Jerusalem summoned Poland's ambassador to Israel to express Israel's displeasure over the bill. This is not a historic dialogue about responsibility for the Holocaust. Rather, it is a moral duty of Poland towards its former citizens, whose property was confiscated during the Holocaust and under the communist rule. This was said by Alon Bar, head of our Foreign Ministry's Strategic Political Department. Now, in turn, Warsaw summoned Israel's charge d'affaires in Warsaw for a tongue-lashing over what they called Israel's intervening in the internal affairs of a foreign state. Poles, like Jews, were victims of terrible German crimes. This was tweeted by the Deputy Foreign Minister of Poland. He said the act passed in the same protects the victims of these crimes and their heirs against fraud and abuse, unquote. Now, the question we have to ask ourselves is this just an internal affair of Poland, or is it really a blatant denial of being part of one of history's darkest events? By the way, you can ask yourself, why is it that the major death camps that the Germans built were on Polish soil? A lot of it has to do about what the Germans knew about the Polish attitude toward the Jews. Poland was famous or infamous for its attitude toward the Jews before World War II for many years. Poland. So the question again, is this just an internal affair or a denial of being part of one's history's really horrible moments? Now, Poland can justify the bill however it wants, but its bold attempt to heap another injustice on the millions killed on its soil during the Holocaust is nothing short of outrageous. Israel's response is not only justified, but as the today, Israel is the representative of world Jewry. It is imperative. By the way, the United States is backing up Israel's position. By the way, when you talk about Israel being justified, even though the state of Israel did not exist at the time of the Holocaust occurred between 1939 and 1945. Israel didn't come into existence until 1948. Now, this question was raised previously when Israel brought back and found all kinds of Nazi criminals and brought them to justice. The most famous of which made headlines all over the world. So for all practical purposes, no one has questions Israel's position, if you will, as the representative of world Jewry. And that's why it justified all kinds of trials against Nazi war criminals, even though they committed their crimes before the state of Israel came into existence. The same is true today. By the way, the United States is backing up Israel's position. According to the U.S. State Department spokesman, a fellow named Ned Price, tweeted on Friday that the decision of Poland's parliament was a step in the wrong direction. We urge Poland not to move this legislation forward. World Jewish Congress President Ronald Lauder wrote that Poland's actions by passing the bill are a slap in the face of what remains of Polish Jewry and survivors of Nazi brutality. The bottom line is that this Polish legislation must be stopped in its tracks, whether through international pressure or by the Polish leadership realizing that the passage of this bill will add another dimension to the immeasurable suffering endured by Jews during the Holocaust. The bottom line, again, Israel is the successor and it represents world Jewry. The crimes that took place during the Holocaust, most of which were upon Polish soil, these were crimes against the Jewish people. We in Israel are the successor and the descendant of the Jewish people. We represent the world Jewry everywhere. We speak for world Jewry. And Poland now is trying to escape its guilt. We can't bring back any souls that were wiped out during the Holocaust, but besides all the millions of people killed, a massive fortune of Jewish money, Jewish property was stolen during the Holocaust. And we, as the descendants, are the rightful, I guess the best word is we're not just the descendants, we are the rightful heirs of world Jewry, and we represent them. And therefore, the Poles now are trying to deny their responsibility. We cannot change history. There's no two ways about that. We're not trying to change history. But we want justice to be essentially applied to those who survived. And we represent them. So that's the bottom line on this, what's happening now, which is bring a crisis, if you will, between Poland and Israel. And it's nice to know that our government, our new government, understands this responsibility and is stepping forward to see to it that justice is indeed acted and it is seen by the world. So I just wanted to share this with the listeners. It's an item that's a little bit under the headlines, but it's really an important one, and we should be aware of it. We'll have to see how this all works out. When I'm speaking now when the crisis is reaching its head. God willing, next week we'll see how it's going. I'll report to the listeners. So I hope that I've clarified our position and why our position is justified. I'll be back after the break.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
This is Shai Bentiko, and each week I'll be webcasting to you from Judea, origin of the word Jew, a people besieged and beleaguered in every generation. Nazi Germany's but a memory, but in its place the world invented the phantom Palestinians as this generation's internationally authorized Jew killers. Tune in for a different slant on life in Israel, Phantom Nation, every Monday.
Hi, I'm Rabbi David Aaron. The soul basics are the most profound, the most essential, and yet often the most neglected in our education. Join me for Soul Talk on Israel's News Talk Radio and discover the secrets to love, spiritual growth, and personal power.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
We're back with Jay Shapiro. In the previous segment of the program, I spoke about the tension today between Israel and Poland vis-a-vis the Polish denial of returning lost property to Jews families of Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust. That's an issue in itself. But I want to say a few more words about the fact that anti-Semitism refuses to die. It's the world's oldest disease. Nearly 20 years ago, in September 2001, the United Nations Human Rights Commission held a conference ostensibly to mark the end of the apartheid in South Africa and to adopt an auspicious plan to eliminate racism and discrimination worldwide. Instead, what happened was this event, it was a big event, it was held in Durban, South Africa, and instead of really doing away with hate or putting hate in a blacklist, instead it launched a virulent wave of hate and anti-Semitism that continues to spread its deadly poison. Now, this Durban conference had three frameworks: a diplomatic framework, a youth framework, and NGO, non-government organization. At the diplomatic conference, when the proposed text, which singled out Israel that accusations of genocide and ethnic cleansing and war crimes and all kind of similar language, when this was introduced, the American and Israel delegations walked out. The Europeans and the Canadians stayed and brokered a revised text that greatly reduced but did not eliminate the anti-Israel focus. Whether or not this is the right decision continues to be debated. By staying and compromising, these officials, in particular the Europeans and the Canadians, gave legitimacy to basically an illegitimate process. But the most damaging aspect was the NGO forum, including 1,500 participating organizations with the primary aim of waging a deadly war of hate against Israel. This part of the event was irresponsibly funded by the United Nations, the European Union, Canada, and also the Ford Foundation. There were mass marches throughout the streets of Durban. The hate material was distributed, including the infamous Protocols of the Elders of Zion and signs with a Star of David alongside a swastika. NGO representatives led by Human Rights Watch blocked and threatened Jewish speakers who did not toe the anti-Israel line. The UN High Commissioner, the former Irish President Mary Robinson, presided over these events but failed to respond. Afterwards, she meekly declared that there was nothing she could have done. So, interestingly enough, the plans for hijacking this Durban meeting were announced openly at a UN preparatory meeting in Tehran. Based on this script, the NGO forum's final declaration singled out Israel repeatedly with accusations of war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and even genocide, and presenting an action plan for the complete and international isolation of Israel as an apartheid state. Just as the South African apartheid regime was overturned, Israel should be eliminated. Israel, keep in mind, is the nation state of the Jewish people. Now, after Durban, the same NGO leaders and their UN allies moved quickly to implement the boycott and lawfare campaigns, proclaiming that legitimate criticism of Israel policies is what they're doing. In addition to discriminatory boycotts, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, was used as a platform that can be readily manipulated by anti-Israel campaigners through false allegations and propaganda. This fuels the incitement that in turn leads to anti-Semitic attacks around the world, and we have seen this since 2001. The results of the Durban meeting can be seen almost every day and increasingly in the last 6 months. Now, in response to this, what happened was that some recognized the urgent need for confronting this hatred, and they launched a process that led to the international consensus working definition of anti-Semitism, which was adopted in 2016 by the governmental members of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. It's known as the IHRA. As examples of this hatred, all of which are part of the NGO Durban strategy, they included denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination by claiming that the existence of the State of Israel is a racist endeavor, applying double standards, and drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. Now, 20 years have gone by since the Durban meeting, and unfortunately, the Durban NGO strategy is being implemented through attacks on different fronts. Poisonous apartheid weeks, featuring the same NGOs and their anti-Israel slogans, are annual events on university campuses in the United States, inciting attacks on Jewish students who identify with Israel. Human Rights Watch and their allies, such as the organization Al-Haq, ALHAK, as well as some radical Israel NGOs, are funded by European governments to act as political subcontractors, and they continue to market the apartheid slogan, including a recent campaign and report that used the term 200 times and received widespread media coverage with no justification. Now they have combined themselves together under the false banners of intersectionality, which is a new about 20-year-old definition, and solidarity, adding the term Jewish supremacy to this poisonous agenda. Anti-Semitic attacks are at the highest level since the end of the Holocaust, including in the United States, or I should say especially in the United States. And in parallel, the NGO network is pushing a well-funded campaign to dismantle the IHRA working definition, disguised as an alternative Jerusalem definition without the Israeli-related examples, precisely because it's the most effective mechanism for defeating the Durban strategy. So now, as if the current plague of anti-Semitism is insufficient, the UN Human Rights Council is planning a conference to revive and celebrate Durban, likely to be held in September of this year. Back in 2009, the major democracies stayed away from the Durban II in Geneva. There was a Durban meeting in Geneva, and under the leadership of the NGO Monitor and like-minded groups, the NGO Forum was canceled. Durban III was held in 2011, was a non-event. But now the anti-Israel majority of the UN Human Rights Council is trying again. While the US, Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom have announced a boycott, others, particularly in Europe, have not. They are going to attend this anti-Semitic meeting. Now, the bottom line is that the UN and NGO network have hijacked the human rights agenda in order to demonize Israel, and this continues to spread its poison. For world leaders who claim to oppose anti-Semitism, their complicity and silence in the wake of this virulent targeting of Israel and the Jewish people has already gone too far. So they should really oppose any further Durban hate fest. So unfortunately, anti-Semitism, which we thought had died after the Holocaust, is not only is still with us, but it's growing, and perhaps surprisingly, it's growing also in the United States. So this is a major problem. We have learned over the last 2,000 years that I guess we have to live with it. We did not expect it to show its ugly head again in a democracy like the United States. I think, quite honestly, that since the Biden administration took over, the United States in a different kind of crisis, but it includes anti-Israel and anti-Semitic aspects. I'm sorry to have to discuss this subject again, but it's here and we have to live with it, and we should know about it.
Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. Just click the orange button at the top of the IsraelNewsTalkRadio.home page, log in as yourself or an anonymous guest, and join in on the fun. You'll meet other listeners from all over the world who listen to Israel News Talk Radio, and you can make new friends. Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. It's the closest you can get to being in the studio with us.
We love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.